News of the Times. The last aristocrat hanged. The shocking case of Earl Ferrers, 1760. In 1760, Britain witnessed a moment unlike anything seen before or since: the public execution of a peer of the realm, Laurence Earl Ferrers, wealthy, titled, and descended from the Plantagenets. He was escorted through London in a white silk wedding suit to die at Tyburn for the murder of his steward. His crime was brutal, his trial was unprecedented, and his execution marked the final time in British history that an aristocrat faced the gallows. What began as a dispute over money and loyalty spiraled into one of the most notorious cases of the century. Behind the oak-panelled walls of his Leicestershire estate, Lord Ferrers' violent temper, heavy drinking, and deep paranoia created an atmosphere of terror that would ultimately end in murder. Tried before the House of Lords, surrounded by the full ceremony of the Georgian legal system, his case became a national spectacle, raising questions about madness, privilege, and whether nobles truly stood equal before the law. In today's episode, we step into the world of 18th century England to uncover the dramatic downfall of a man born into power yet undone by his own hand. But before we close, a little something lighter, a glimpse of Victorian democracy in its most spirited form. Hyde Park Speaker's Corner in 1894, a sunny afternoon, a confident orator, and a crowd determined to keep him humble. Public debate with heckling included. So, settle yourselves comfortably, refill your cup, and let us carry you back to an age when Britain was governed by Georges. Manners were powdered, tempers were not, and even the aristocracy could find themselves on the wrong end of a noose. It is a journey through privilege, passion, and one very public reckoning. By the dawn of the 5th of May 1760, London was heaving. Word had spread. A lord, a real titled aristocrat, was to die at Tyburn. From Marble Arch to Holborn, every window, rooftop, and roadside was packed with spectators drawn by the extraordinary novelty of the day. This was no common felons' procession. It was a moment the city had never witnessed and would never witness again. And as the Earl's carriage reached the outer gate, the execution began to take its solemn shape. From the Newgate calendar, the 5th of May 1760, Laurence Earl Ferrers executed at Tyburn before the murder of his steward after a trial by his peers. On the carriage reaching the outer gate, the Earl was delivered up to the sheriffs, and Mr. Sheriff Valiant entered the vehicle with him, expressing his concern at having so melancholy a duty to perform. But his lordship said he was much obliged to him, and took it kindly that he accompanied him. The Earl was attired in a white suit, richly embroidered with silver, and when he put it on, he said, "This is the suit in which I was married, and in which I will die." The procession formed and moved off at a slow, deliberate pace, led by horse grenadiers and followed by carriages of officials, friends, and finally the hearse that would carry his body to Surgeons' Hall. It was a strangely formal cortege, part military escort, part funeral, befitting the unprecedented execution of a peer of the realm. The crowd was so dense that the procession crept forward at a crawl, leaving Lord Ferrers nearly 3 hours in his landau. He remained calm, even courteous, although he admitted more than once that he wished the business was over. The apparatus of death, he remarked, and the passing through such crowds are worse than death itself. He added with a touch of dry humour that such numbers had gathered only because the public had never seen a lord hanged before. He told the sheriff that he had written to the king to beg that he might suffer where his ancestor, the Earl of Essex, had been executed, and that he had the greatest hopes of obtaining that favour as he had the honour of quartering past of the same arms and of being allied to his majesty, but that he had been refused, and he thought it hard that he must die at the place appointed for the execution of common felons. When the landau advanced to the place of execution, his lordship alighted from it and ascended the scaffold with the same composure and fortitude of mind he had exhibited from the time he left the Tower. Soon after he had mounted the scaffold, Mr. Humphreys asked his lordship if he chose to say prayers, which he declined. But upon his asking him if he did not choose to join with him in the Lord's Prayer, he readily answered he would, for he always thought it a very fine prayer. Upon which they knelt down together upon two cushions covered with black baize, and his lordship, with an audible voice, very devoutly repeated the Lord's Prayer, and afterwards, with great energy, ejaculated, "O God, forgive me all my errors, pardon all my sins." His lordship then, rising, took his leave of the sheriff and the chaplain, and, after thanking them for their many civilities, presented his watch to Mr. Sheriff Valiant, of which he desired his acceptance, and he requested that his body might be buried at Bredon or Stanton in Leicestershire. The executioner now proceeded to do his duty, to which his lordship, with great resignation, submitted, his neckcloth being taken off, and a white cap which he had brought in his pocket being put upon his head, his arms secured by a black sash, and the cord put round his neck. He advanced by 3 steps to the elevated part of the scaffold, and, standing under the crossbeam which went over it, which was also covered with black baize, he asked the executioner, "Am I right?" Then the cap was drawn over his face, and, upon a signal given by the sheriff, for his lordship, upon being before asked, declined to give one himself, that part upon which he stood instantly sank down from beneath his feet, and he was launched into eternity on the 5th of May, 1760. Although his composure and ceremonial dress lent a certain dignity to his final moments, the punishment did not end at the scaffold. As was customary for those convicted of murder, the law required that his body undergo anatomization, a final public confirmation of justice carried out. The accustomed time of 1 hour being passed, the coffin was raised up with the greatest decency to receive the body, and, being deposited in the hearse, he was conveyed by the sheriffs with the same procession to Surgeons' Hall to undergo the remainder of the sentence. A large incision was then made from the neck to the bottom of the breast, and another across the throat. The lower part of the belly was laid open, and the bowels taken away. It was afterwards publicly exposed to view in a room upon 1 pair of stairs at the hall, and on the evening of Thursday the 8th of May it was delivered to his friends for interment. To understand the shock that Lord Ferrers' execution caused, we must first step back into England of the early 1760s, a nation teetering between old certainties and new anxieties. George II sat on the throne, the last British monarch born on continental shore, presiding over a society where class shaped almost every aspect of life. A few months after Ferrers' death, the crown would pass to his grandson, George III, familiar to many Americans, but the deep social divisions remained unchanged. Class at the time shaped all manner of life, absolutely everything. Not just where one lived, but how one spoke, what one ate, and how justice itself was applied. At the very top sat the aristocracy, a small, glittering tier of families with ancient titles, vast estates, and political influence that passed from father to son like an heirloom. Their lives were cushioned by wealth, servants, and the reassuring belief that the machinery of power existed fundamentally for their benefit. When the law appeared, it tended to knock politely. Below them sprawled the great majority of the population, tenant farmers struggling against rent and weather, labourers whose livelihoods rose and fell with the seasons, tradesmen who hoped simply to stay solvent, and the urban poor for whom misfortune could so easily end in debtor's prison. For these classes, the hand of the law was firm, visible, and often brutal. Tyburn, with its triangular gallows, was a familiar landmark to ordinary Londoners. Executions were public, crowded, and treated half as a cautionary spectacle, half as grim entertainment. Thieves, forgers, highwaymen, and the desperate poor mounted those wooden steps with regularity. But a nobleman? A peer of the realm? Descendant from the Plantagenets? Such a thing did not happen. The aristocracy might suffer scandal, exile, or a sharp word in the House of Lords, but the gallows were for other people. The idea that a titled gentleman could stand before a crowd of thousands, exposed to the same justice as a common felon, was not merely unusual, it was almost unthinkable. And yet in 1760, that impossibility became reality. The fall of Earl Ferrers could not only shock polite society, it would fracture the illusion that rank alone could shield a man from the consequence of his actions. To understand just how shocking this was, we must look more closely at the life he led and the violent excesses that brought him there. From the Newgate calendar, the 5th of May, 1760, Laurence, Earl of Ferrers, was descendant of an ancient and noble family. The royal blood of the Plantagenets flowed in his veins, and the Earl gained his title in the following manner. In the year 1711, Robert Lord Ferrers was created by Queen Anne, Viscount Tamworth and Earl Ferrers, and it appears that although the estates of the family were very great, they were vastly diminished by the provisions which the Earl thought proper to make for his numerous progeny, consisting of 15 sons and 12 daughters, born to him by his 2 wives. At the death of the first Earl, his title descended to the father of the Earl Laurence. This nobleman was married in the year 1752 to the youngest daughter of Sir William Meredith. Although his general conduct when sober was not such as to be remarkable, yet his faculties were so much impaired by drink that when under the influence of intoxication he acted with all the wildness and brutality of a madman. But the fall of a peer does not begin at the gallows. Long before Earl Ferrers entered the pages of history as the last nobleman hanged at Tyburn, he had already carved out a troubling reputation. His temper, his drinking, and his unpredictable violence were spoken of in whispers below stairs and with polite horror in drawing rooms. It is this pattern of conduct that we now turn, for it laid the path to his downfall long before the fatal shot was fired. The Derby race incident. One early sign of Lord Ferrers' volatility came at the Derby races in 1756. He had just won a £50 wager running his mare against the horse of a Captain M. The evening ended in good spirits, but during the conversation the captain, having heard quite innocently that Ferrers' mare was in foal, joked that he would be happy to race her again in 7 months' time. To most it would have been harmless banter. To Lord Ferrers it was a calculated insult. In a fury, he left Derby at 3 o'clock in the morning and rode straight back to his estate at Stanton Harold. Upon waking, he ran violently for his servants, demanded to know who had revealed the mare's condition. The groom denied it, the servant denied it. His temper rose all the higher for lack of a target. Adding to the perceived slight, Ferrers had invited the captain and several gentlemen to dine with him that day. When they all declined, politely but firmly, he interpreted it as further proof of conspiracy. He exploded. Servants were kicked, horsewhipped, and struck with whatever object he could seize. What to an outsider had been a trivial misunderstanding became, in Ferrers' mind, a personal humiliation, and his rage was both sudden and frightening. The oyster incident. Not long afterwards came an incident that the household would remember with dread. A batch of oysters arrived from London, but they were spoiled. Lord Ferrers immediately accused the carrier of tampering with them and demanded that a servant swear an oath to that effect. When the man refused to lie, Ferrers erupted. He struck him with a candlestick, stabbed him with a small knife, and kicked him so violently that the injuries affected him for years. It was an assault over something as trivial as delivering gone wrong, and it left the staff in no doubt about how suddenly and how savagely their master could turn. The family break. Not long afterwards, Ferrers' temper again erupted, this time in front of his own family. His brother and sister-in-law were visiting Stanton Harold when a disagreement arose. Lady Ferrers had stepped out of the room, but her husband worked into a fury, ran upstairs, clutching a large clasp knife, and demanded to know where she was. A servant, alarmed, led him to her chamber. There, Ferrers ordered the man to load 2 pistols with bullets. The servant reluctantly obeyed, but, fearful of what might follow, he left the pistols unprimed. Ferrers noticed immediately, cursed him, and demanded powder and primed them himself. He then thrust a pistol into the servant's hands and commanded him to go downstairs and shoot Ferrers' own brother. When the terrified man hesitated, Ferrers pulled the trigger of one of the pistols himself. It misfired, the single stroke of luck that prevented a second tragedy. Lady Ferrers fell to her knees, pleading with him to stop. Ferrers turned his rage on her as well, threatening her life if she interfered. The servant fled and managed to warn the visitors, who gathered their things and escaped the house in the middle of the night. It would not be long before Lady Ferrers followed their example. His moods, his violence, and unpredictable rages became so intolerable that she sought legal protection and a separate maintenance through Parliament, an extraordinary step for a woman of her rank. Lady Ferrers' departure did more than fracture the household. It rewired her husband's world. Parliament stepped in, granting her a separate maintenance drawn from the estate, and trustees were appointed to oversee the arrangement. And with those trustees came a man whose fate would soon be sealed, Mr. Johnson, the estate steward. He was loyal, steady, and had served the family since boyhood. But to a man already drowning in drink, rage, and suspicion, Johnson became the perfect target, the symbol of everything Ferrers believed had been taken from him. It was this resentment that would, in time, pull both men into a room at Stanton Hall and close the door behind them. From the Newgate calendar, the 5th of May, 1760. Parliament's intervention meant Lady Ferrers could now receive a separate income from the estate managed by appointed trustees. They required some trustworthy to oversee the rents. That responsibility fell to Mr. Johnson, a man raised in the household, known for his neat accounts and quiet competence. He initially refused the role, aware of Ferrers' temper, but the Earl himself insisted, and Johnson reluctantly agreed. By this time, Ferrers was living at his Leicestershire estate at Stanton, with Mrs. Clifford and her 4 daughters, supported by a sizable staff. Johnson lived half a mile away at a farm called the Lount, which he rented from the Earl. For a while, their arrangements worked. Johnson visited Stanton periodically to settle accounts, but as Ferrers' paranoia deepened, he began to see the steward not as a servant, but as an enemy, a man conspiring with the trustees, a man withholding opportunities, a man standing between him and control of his own estate. He railed against Johnson publicly, calling him a villain, and eventually gave him notice to quit his farm. Still, Johnson continued his duties. Then came the Sunday of the 13th of January, 1760, when Ferrers instructed him to return the following Friday at 3 o'clock. It was an appointment Johnson kept, although it would cost him his life. That Friday, Ferrers carefully cleared the house. Mrs. Clifford and her daughters were sent out for a walk. The male servants were dispatched on errands. Only a few women remained. When Johnson arrived, he was shown into the still house to wait. After several minutes, Ferrers summoned him to his private room and locked the door behind him. He demanded, first, that Johnson settle the accounts. Then, turning suddenly, he accused him of treachery, commanded him to kneel, and shouted loudly enough for the maids outside to hear. "Down on your other knee. Declare that you have acted against Lord Ferrers. Your time is come. You must die." He drew a loaded pistol and fired. The ball struck Johnson, who staggered but remained alive, pleading for mercy. The noise brought the servants running, and Ferrers stepped away just long enough for the awful truth to spread throughout the household. Earl had finally acted on the violence he had long threatened. A messenger was sent at once for Mr. Kirkland, a surgeon from nearby Ashby de la Zouche. Johnson, barely able to stand, was placed in a bed. Ferrers came to him first, asking how he felt. Johnson replied plainly that he was dying and asked that his family be brought to him. Miss Johnson soon arrived, and Ferrers followed her into the room. He pulled down the bedclothes, applied a pledget soaked in captivates water to the wound, a gesture oddly tender in appearance, although hardly sincere, and then left. After that brief flicker of concern, the Earl turned to the comfort he trusted most, drink. He drank heavily, and as the alcohol took hold, His temper rose with it. By the time Mr. Kirkland, the surgeon, arrived, Ferrers admitted freely that he had shot Johnson and insisted that the man had deserved it. He added, with remarkable logic, that although he had meant to kill him since he hadn't, Kirkland should do what he could to preserve Johnson's life. At the same time, Ferrers warned the surgeon that he must not allow him to be seized, declaring that he would shoot anyone who attempted it. Kirkland assured him no one would touch him, and went to examine the wounded man. He found the bullet lodged deep, and when he mentioned it, Ferrers expressed surprise. He had tested the pistol only days earlier, and he knew it capable of piercing a thick board. The surgeon went downstairs to prepare dressings. The Earl drifted away. But the more he drank, the more ungovernable he became. Whatever momentary remorse he had displayed vanished beneath fresh waves of rage and malice. He returned repeatedly to Johnson's bedside, pulled him by the wig, called him a villain, and threatened to shoot him again. At one point, he tried to tear the bedclothes off to strike him, and the women in the house had to intervene. Mrs. Clifford suggested that Johnson be moved to his own home for care. Ferrers refused outright. "He shall not be removed. I will keep him here to plague the villain." Later he told Miss Johnson that if her father died, he would provide for the family so long as they did not prosecute. When at last he went to bed, sometime around 11, he told Mr. Kirkland that he expected him to help shape the matter in such a light that Ferrers would not be seized in the morning. Kirkland, however, had other intentions. Once the Earl was asleep, he acted swiftly. He went to the lounge, fetched help, improvised a sedan chair from an easy chair and poles, and returned around 2 in the morning to remove Johnson from the house. Johnson died at 9 o'clock the next day. News spread quickly, and the neighbours gathered to secure the Earl. Armed men went to Stanton, where they found Ferrers, partially undressed, heading toward the stables, perhaps to escape on horseback. A local man, Springthorpe, levelled a pistol at him and demanded his surrender. Ferrers reached towards his pocket. Springthorpe hesitated, fearing a weapon, and the Earl slipped back into the house. After 2 hours of shouting, Ferrers finally appeared at an upper window and called out, "How is Johnson?" When told he was dead, Ferrers shouted back that it was a lie and ordered the crowd to disperse, and instructed his servants to provide the onlookers with food and drink. He then withdrew again, swearing no man would take him. The crowd refused to leave, and after 2 tense hours the Earl was finally spotted outside, walking calmly across the bowling green, armed with a blunderbuss, 2 pistols, and a dagger. A local collier named Curtis approached him directly, undaunted by the array of weapons. Ferrers, impressed by the man's courage, surrendered at once and handed over his arms, although he could not resist declaring that he had killed the villain and was proud of it. He was taken immediately to a public house in Ashby, kept by a man named Kinsey, and a coroner's jury quickly returned a verdict of wilful murder, and on the following Monday the Earl was committed to Leicester jail. As a peer of the realm, however, Ferrers was entitled to be tried before the House of Lords. About a fortnight later he was transported to London in his landau, drawn by 6 horses and escorted under heavy guard. He was formally presented at Westminster, placed in the custody of the Black Rod, and then conveyed to the Tower of London, arriving there at around 6 in the evening on the 14th of February. In the Tower he was kept under strict but respectful watch. 2 warders remained constantly in his room, another stood at the door, and sentinels guarded the stairs and drawbridge. The gates were ordered shut an hour earlier of each day. Ferrers behaved with outward calm throughout his confinement. His habits were moderate: tea with a little brandy for breakfast, wine diluted with water at dinner, and supper and simple meals. Yet his composure was not constant. From time to time he would suddenly start, tear open his waistcoat, or make odd, agitated gestures, signs that his mind was far from settled. The trial by peers. For a common man in 1760, a murder charge meant the Old Bailey, a brisk hearing, and, more often than not, the gallows. But Earl Ferrers was no common man. As a peer of the realm, he was entitled to something entirely different: trial before the House of Lords, with every lord in the kingdom summoned to sit in judgment. It was a rare and solemn spectacle, part legal proceeding, part state ceremony, reminding the public that while nobles might be higher in rank, they were still answerable to the crown. And so, after 2 months in the Tower, guarded day and night, Laurence Shirley, 4th Earl Ferrers, was brought before the highest court in the land. The trial before the House of Lords, the 16th to the 18th of April, 1760. On the 16th of April, after 62 days in the Tower, Lord Ferrers was taken under guard to Westminster Hall for his trial, presided over by the assembled House of Lords. Lord Henley, Keeper of the Great Seal, had been appointed Lord High Steward for the occasion, a title used only for the gravest of proceedings. The case itself was straightforward. The murder of his steward, Mr. Johnson, was clearly proven. Ferrers mounted his own defence, calling witnesses to suggest he was not of sound mind, but although several testified to his erratic behaviour, none could establish the levels of insanity required to absolve him of legal responsibility. In fact, his defence only underscored his intelligence. At one point he acknowledged with painful honesty that he had attempted the insanity plea only solely to satisfy his friends. He had never believed it himself, and he knew it would not save him. When the evidence had been weighed, each peer pronounced his verdict aloud in turn. The result was unanimous: guilty. Ferrers was sentenced to be hanged on Monday, the 21st of April, and his body autonomized afterwards, the standard punishment for murder. But even in condemnation, privilege lingered. The execution was delayed until the 5th of May, reportedly to allow time for the elaborate arrangements required for a peer of the realm. During this interval, Ferrers made a will leaving generous sums to Johnson's children, to his own natural daughters, and a modest annuity to Mrs. Clifford. But because these provisions were written after his conviction, they had no legal force, although it was later said that similar financial support was privately honoured. And so, as the scaffold was dismantled and the crowds drifted away from Tyburn, Britain was left with a moment that would never come again. Laurence Earl Ferrers entered the history books as a man of contradictions, violent yet articulate, privileged yet unrestrained, a peer of the realm who believed himself untouchable until the law proved otherwise. His execution on the 5th of May 1760 stands as one of the great historical thresholds, the last time an aristocrat in Britain was put to death by public hanging. In a century defined by rigid hierarchy, Ferrers became an unsettling reminder that rank could protect a great many things, but not everything. The law might bend, it might hesitate, but in this case, it did not break. And that is why his story earns his place in our January theme of firsts and lasts, a final public reckoning for the titled elite, a last walk to Tyburn for a peer of the realm, and a first glimpse for many in that vast London crowd of true equality before the gallows. With that, we close the chapter on Earl Ferrers, a cautionary tale, a historical anomaly, and a case that continues to echo through the centuries. Further particulars. Before we leave Earl Ferrers behind, we thought we'd finish with something a little lighter and unmistakably British. For those who haven't visited London's Hyde Park, there is a place on its northeastern edge known as Speaker's Corner, a small patch of ground where, since the mid-19th century, anyone with a stool, a voice, and sufficient enthusiasm could hold forth on politics, philosophy, religion, economics, or whatever grievance they felt the nation needed to hear. It was, and still is, part soapbox, part theatre, part chaos. On any given Sunday, crowds gathered to listen, heckle, cheer, mutter, contradict, and occasionally attempt to improve the hairstyle of the speaker in question. Victorian newspapers loved it. It was democracy with commentary. Today's further particulars comes from one such afternoon in 1894, when the sun was bright, the audience was restless, and an orator with more confidence than caution attempted to enlighten the masses. What follows was a scene that could only have taken place at Speaker's Corner, half rhetoric, half comedy, and entirely British. Hence then, from the Flintshire orator is a small reminder that public debate has always been equal parts passion and performance. From the Flintshire orator, the 12th of April 1894, the public orator. It was Sunday afternoon, and the sun shone brightly on the shifting masses of population that thronged Hyde Park. A crowd stood round a tree, and a man on a chair with his back to the bowl made a speech in the House of Commons manner. Round and beefy of countenance, with a black moustache and a short beard, he appeared to be in health. His coat was more than respectable, and his hat shone as to the hats of omnibus drivers. He started, "Gentlemen, it is some considerable to me the most eventful interval since I enjoyed the honour and the pleasure of addressing such a loud and intellectual audience as I see here gathered around me." Voice in the crowd, "Get your hair cut." So long, sir. Ask me head is on my own shoulders, and so long as you refuse to repay me that last sixpence I lent you, I will not get my hair cut at your request. Laughter. "Gentlemen, I have seen the sunshine on America and on the waters of the Pacific Ocean since I last occupied a chair in this park, and gave you the result of my experience in relation to the great problems of the day. I have known hard times, gentlemen, and in that past period of my existence, although the coat on me back and the tile on me head might seem to contradict me, but like a very eminent personage in the book of Job, I have been walking up and down the face of the earth, literally often seeking what I might devour." Voice. "Was the devil an Irishman?" Much laughter, in which the orator joined a little uneasily. I'm glad to see so many Irishmen here this afternoon. I feel more at home. But, gentlemen, let me refer for a moment to the speakers who have preceded me. They have all missed the point, except one man, who I think was an Irishman, like myself. Laughter. They have been like men running a race in the dark. They didn't know where they were running to, and they didn't know when to stop. Voice. They were wandering like you and the devil. My fatuous friend will perhaps pardon me if I ignore his irrelevant and irreverent interruption. I am not ashamed that I have wandered in the cause of liberty. Stern-faced youth. Hear, hear! But, gentlemen, what do I stand here to tell you this afternoon? What have I travelled thousands of miles to impart to you? What is the foundation of me faith, the hope of me life, the reason of me existence? Voice. Give it up, monkey puzzle. Gentlemen, what I am here to tell you is this, and I hope our monkey puzzle friend will think over it and the solitude of his midnight chamber, that unless the democracy of this crumbling realm organizes itself, then it will be crushed when the upper portions fall to pieces from natural and senile decay. Who are the lords? We are the lords. We are the lords if we organize. If not, we are slaves. Unless the working men of the effete and rotten civilization stick together, they will be separated and devoured one by the greedy and insatiable capitalists who are already gorged with the blood, aye, and with the bones of their victims. Unless we sink all the petty and paltry differences that divide us and demand with one gigantic and discordant voice our natural and unalienable rights, we will find very soon that we won't have any rights to demand. And with that, we gently close the ledger of one of Britain's most theatrical downfalls. If nothing else, Earl Ferrers leaves us with a lesson. Never combine drink, firearms, and an aristocratic sense of entitlement. Now, if you're still with us, marvellous. Do give the like button a tap, subscribe if you fancy more, and feel free to fling this episode at unsuspecting friends. The algorithm adores such dramatic gestures. Should you crave even more historical delight, our Patreon is positively brimming. 800 plus ad-free episodes, daily posts, and our trio of exclusive series. Mysterious Britain, Fog, Ye Old Newsroom, Chaos, and Robin & Co. Too much information. All unlocked for a tidy little £5 a month. One click in, one click out. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, medieval bookmark collector, freelance ghost herder, and occasional wrangler of troublesome dukes. Until we meet next, my brilliant armchair sleuths, keep your tea strong, your wits sharper, and your notes ready. One never knows when history will misbehave again.